Tēnā tātou. Tuatahira, kamahia koutou, te hau kaika. Tēnā koe teo o tō mihi whakatau ki au. Nōku te whiwhi kia hoki mai ki tēnei whenua taurikura, ki te kōrero kia koutou i te kai o te pōnei ko te kōrero mo te Aoraki me te mātauraka Māori. Ko Victoria Campbell te hōku ikua, no oti poti e hau, kei Moeraki e hau e mahi ana. Nō reira, huri noi te whare, tēnā tātou katoa. So firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the wonderful warm welcome. Thank you. It's always a privilege to spend time here in Te Anau. My whakapapa extends down into this region, so it's always really warming to come back to the community and not only be embedded into the landscape again, but also to connect with the people. And so I want to thank you all for taking time out of your Friday evening to come along and share kōrero with me tonight. And I've prepared a lot of things because I wasn't too sure what the dynamic of the audience would be, so I like to make sure that I've got a little something for everyone, hopefully. So she's going to be a hot mess of a PowerPoint presentation. And I do encourage a bit of interaction, so you've got two choices. You can save your questions to the end and hope that you can remember them if you're a little bit shy. Otherwise, I will pause throughout the presentation so that if you have any questions or want any clarification, please do so. Dale mentioned wānanga or wānaka, and that's what we're doing tonight. And that's just not me simply talking to you. It's us having a conversation together. And I've got this slide to help promote some kōrero for us. So thank you. And also a big mihi to Crystal and the team who have made this possible. My apologies, I was scheduled to come down at Matariki, but I'm not sure if you know or not, we had an unexpected tragedy in our whānau, and we actually lost a 14-year-old boy that was not only a nephew, but a close family connect. So obviously I spent time there. We have farewelled him in the way that we needed to, but I bring him with me tonight and we'll be thinking of him right through until Matariki sets, and then we will think of him again when the new helical rising of Matariki. So I'm back now, my heart is full. We go through these things, but then we keep going, and my apologies for not being here during Matariki, but I'm certainly very happy to be here this evening, and thank you. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so tonight, we've got a broad range, as I said, but hopefully I'm going to share some things about culture. I'm going to share some things about identity and mātauraka Māori, and hopefully you'll find some relevance in that and broaden your insights and see how you might be able to apply some of this, not only in the work that you do, but also in how you live your life. Okay, so before we kick into things, I always like to set a bit of a tone, and what this does is it gives you an insight into my perspective, into my worldview, and I know it's very unique. I've had the privilege of going to university and learning Māori and Te Ao Māori and the arts as a subject. I've also had the privilege of being engaged with the iwi for over 20 years, and the learning and exposure that I've had to all our tribal history and language has been a combination of things that I've learned in an academic setting and within a tribal setting, and I know that it's a real privilege to have a combination of both, and so that's why I thought we'll share a little bit of my thinking. So the first thing is that Māori personify the world. And what this does is it creates a tātai whakapapa, or a genealogy that binds us to the earth, the sky, and the universe. And so you may know of Raki Nui, Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku, Earth Mother. That's an example of personification. And I have whakapapa, or genealogy, that can link me right back to what science describes as the singularity, and from that we get the Big Bang. Think of raki, think of papa, that's the singularity right there. They get split apart, Big Bang, and then we come into the world of light, and from that we have millennia of evolution right through to us. So that's personification. The second thing is we believe in an open system. I'm not a science person, I'm an arts person, but I'll give you a brief description of what an open system is. So if you think of a pot that's sitting on a flame, you've got some water in that pot. The water starts to get hot, it boils and we get steam. If there's no lid on the pot, it's considered an open system because all the things in the pot, the water, the steam, can interact with everything outside of the pot. If you put a lid on that pot, it's now a closed system, which means that the steam and all that can't come out. The things inside the pot cannot interact with the things outside the pot. That's how we see the world, no lid. So what we see and experience is not all that is out there, and I think that a lot of people can appreciate that perspective. And the last thing, which is pretty much the most important thing, is whakapapa. Now, I've got the genealogy, but whakapapa is more than just genealogy. It's the very fabric of Māori social organisation. So we are able to organise ourselves through time and space using whakapapa. And an example of this is that when I talk about the arrival, when Ngāi Tahu or Waitaha made their way here to Te Waipounamu, we will articulate that saying 32 generations ago this ancestor arrived here. Gets a little bit confusing when you keep using the same ancestor names throughout genealogy, but it also explains systems and it explains our relationships, not only to each other, but to the natural world. So when we go into the natural world, for example, if we're going to Te Waonui or Tāne or the forest, we know that we're entering into that domain. And we think about the connections that we have to Tāne and to all of the descendants that are residing within that dominion. Ka pai? Any questions so far? We're away. Okay. So the other thing that I thought would be helpful is providing a bit of a definition. What is mātauraka Māori? Mātauraka Māori is Māori knowledge. So it's a body of knowledge that originates from Māori ancestry or from people who have whakapapa to Māori ancestors. It includes our worldview and perspectives. It's all of our creativity and all of our cultural practices. So that is mātauraka Māori. And it's an evolving body of knowledge. And one of the beautiful things about mātauraka Māori is we take a traditional body of knowledge and contemporary knowledge and we take both of them with us. We don't just go, oh, how do I balance between traditional and contemporary? We don't. We take it all with us and go, this is what it is. And that's how we view knowledge, is that you're continually adding to it. And I've got some examples throughout the presentation that should build on that concept for you. So then the other question is that sometimes people ask, well, what is kaupapa Māori? Because sometimes people hear, oh, that's kaupapa Māori. For me, the easiest way to explain kaupapa Māori, it's the way in which you apply Māori knowledge. So you have Māori knowledge, and then kaupapa Māori is the way that I use that knowledge in my practices and in my learnings or in my teachings, for example. Ka pai? Awesome. Okay, given that it's Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, I've put a bit of te reo throughout my presentation as well, and it was really awesome that we were able to start this evening listening to te reo takitaki o tēnei whenua, to the Indigenous language of Aotearoa. Now, brief history lesson in 20 seconds. Māori arrived here around 850 years ago, bit more maybe, around the 1200s. Archaeology might, give us some more insight into that. Once again, we say generation anyway. That's how we measure our occupation here. We had contact, everyone spoke Te Reo Māori, then we become a colony, and legislation, social policies and social attitudes meant that Māori shifted from being the dominant language of New Zealand to becoming a minority language of New Zealand. And so over a period of about 130 to 50 years, critical language loss occurred. And so we know that around 1975, so that's like 130 years, 135 years after the treaty, 5% of Māori children could speak Te Reo Māori. So Te Reo Māori was in a really vulnerable place, and it still is. And in fact, my job for the last 10 years has been working for the iwi in our language team. So we created a language strategy, and I'm going to talk about that briefly too. But what has occurred is intergenerational language loss for up to 130 years. So when we talk about mātauraka Māori and we talk about kaupapa Māori, we also need to be mindful that we're still in a reclamation space. So we're still reconnecting with this knowledge. And so it's going to take some time, but it's a journey in which everyone can be a part of. And you tonight are a part of that journey because you're here in the room learning things and proving that there's a positive appetite out there in society for mātauraka Māori, which includes Te Reo Māori. And one of the big things that the iwi has focused on is the theory that it takes one generation to lose a language and 3 to claim it back. So we know that we've got a long game. It's not going to be what's going to happen over the next year. We know that until there's a generational shift, it's going to take a little bit of hard work. But we're up for the challenge. I've gone too fast. So with the iwi, in the 1970s, there was actually a cultural survey done by Richard Benton, and what that survey produced was some evidence, some data, and Ngāi Tahu or Ngāi Tahu were at the bottom of the heap when it came to all of the measures that they were looking for. So we were defined as being the least Māori of the Māori. And so that's a pretty devastating place to be in. That's certainly not how we viewed ourselves, but what it did was it gave us a baseline, a place to go, okay, this is where we are, where do we want to be in the future? And so we created a language strategy, and it's a 25-year strategy. It started in 2000. There's only 2 or 3 years left to go. And the goal was that within 25 years, we wanted 1,000 homes within Te Waipounamu speaking Te Reo Māori and using Te Reo Māori as an intergenerational language. And now we're also a pretty business-savvy tribe, and of course this requires investment, and the bean counters are like, well, where's the evidence? We want to know how many homes have you got? I can proudly report that we've got over 4,000 homes in our database. I'm like, that's not reflective of a lot anyway, surveys are only as good as the people filling them in. But what we do know and what we say to the bean counters is the real proof will be whether the generation after us are going to speak Te Reo Māori or not. And I can report that back that because it's been 22 odd years, we have children of the people who started the strategy who have been raised as first language speakers. And now some of them are having their own children who are then speaking and using Te Reo Māori as a first language for them. So we have initiated intergenerational language use. So we say to the bean counters, that's all you need. Here are the next generation speaking Te Reo Māori. The other thing that I want to say is that we do need it to be intergenerational. So it's good to see a diverse range of age in the room, because even if you are not going to actively be using Te Reo Māori, being an advocate or champion or supporter of it will certainly help it flourish. And in fact, our national language policies are centred around a theory by Professor Poiarewe and Professor Rawania Higgins, and it talks about a scale with 3 places in it. The first is you're resistant. So you're resistant to Te Reo Māori, you actively go out of your way to discourage it, to try and make it not exist. That's the non-active space. We move into this space, and this is called a passive zone. So this means that you just go about your everyday life, you're not bothered either way whether Te Reo Māori exists or not, but you're not actively doing anything to discourage it or encourage it. And then the third place is the active zone, which means that you are trying to learn more, you encourage it, you're positive, you may be a learner, you may be a speaker. The national goal is to get our country moving from this space of being actively against Te Reo Māori to being in a passive zone so that we can just let the language exist. And so that's what our national kind of language policies are centred on. And what it really underlines is social attitude. So that's what we're looking for, is an attitudinal change towards Te Reo Māori so that it can thrive. You don't have to speak it, but let us speak it. Ka pai, any questions or anything around that? Awesome. Okay, I'm going to move from Te Reo soon into another kaupapa. I said it is Te Wiki with Te Reo. These are the 5 building blocks of language revitalisation. So I thought this is a really good take home for the audience. And this is what our language strategy focuses on at the moment. So the 5 components are, you need to use the language. But in order to use the language, you need to learn the language. And so in order to learn the language, you need a body of knowledge, or the context to the mātauraka to be able to speak Te Reo. And then the other 2 things that you need to be part of it is the language needs to have some type of status. So we need to actually value the language to want to do all these things. And then critical awareness, because some of us aren't even aware, A, that Te Reo Māori might exist, or B, that it's in trouble, or any of the history and so on and so forth. And so what we do as an iwi is we work on building a corpus or a body of Māori language material. And where this comes from is our manuscripts, because we want to use the language of our ancestors. And I've just said for about 130 years that hasn't occurred. So the really nice thing that has happened in our history is that in the mid-1800s, there are a few ethnographers that come to New Zealand, and they just loved having a hui with the chiefs and writing down all of their knowledge. So we've got that body of knowledge. And then in turn, our people took to writing and to recording, and so they indeed also wrote manuscripts in Te Reo Māori about random things, about specific things. So that sits within our archives, within our old libraries like the Hocken Library, the Alexandra Macmillan Library, and so on. And so we have worked really hard to access that knowledge and bring it out of the books and back into our mouths. And one of the cool things that we've done with that is we've realised the context has changed a little in Aotearoa since pre-contact. However, we've got clever people who are visionary, and so we've been able to take language that was used perhaps in warfare and apply it into a new setting, such as rugby or netball or football. And so encouraging someone, go out there, give it heaps, for the battle, shift the context. And so we're still using the language of our ancestors. It's just in a more modern day context. And I think that's a really good example of mātauraka Māori, of traditional and contemporary knowledge combining or building, being part of the same package going forward. Ka pai? Okay. Cool. This I thought was relevant to Te Anau, so I added it in. These are some whakatauki or kiwaha, so proverbial sayings that we use, and I wanted to share these because they also show an insight into Māori perspective and mātauraka Māori. So, me he korokoro tui is a compliment that you would pay to someone who's a beautiful singer or a beautiful orator. You might be familiar with the word tui there. So a tui or a kōkō, I don't even know what their Pākehā names are or if they have one. I think we all know what that bird is. But we compare, this shows that whakapapa or that connection to the natural world. So we compare ourselves to the beautiful songbirds that exist in our environment. E hara I te ti is the equivalent of YOLO, and for those of you like me, I'm like, what does YOLO mean? You only live once. And this tea that it's referring to is a tikaka. So for those of you who know the tikaka, it can grow anywhere pretty much. Give it an inch and it'll get in there and grow. So the tikaka is a prolific breeder. I'm not a dot person, so I don't know what the terminology is for that. Unlike us, we're not, we've got one shot at it, and if we don't get it right, then that's the end. So we're saying, this is actually saying, you're not like a tikaka, so you don't have 9 lives, so to speak. So people go, oh, well, we'll do it anyway. Puaka tohuro, so puaka is the star Rigel, and so this refers to the star and the many signs that it can provide for us. So once again, the environment and us, we're connected. Matariki hukanui, so matariki, who makes people gather together, and I do believe you all gathered together during Matariki here in Te Anau. And the last one, ka whati te tai, ka pau te toria. When the tide recedes, and I wrote a different word the other day, and I was like, didn't do a spell check. I'm like, is it recedes? The toria strikes. So, when the tide goes out, the oyster catcher gets in there and gets all the kai. And so this is about strike while the iron's hot, pretty much. But that language for me articulates that connection that we have with the natural world. And, it just makes my heart sing when you can speak like that. It's very metaphorical. And what it does is it shows the connection that our ancestors had with the environment. And I believe it's that connection that brings us well-being. And so I'm a huge promoter of that because I think it's good for us all. Okay, now we're off te reo. That was my big mahi to te reo. The other thing I want to talk to you about is cultural narratives. Now, cultural narratives for years have been described as myths and legends, and they are not that. They are in fact the very blueprints that have been handed down through generations that give us all the tips and tricks that we need for survival pretty much. And when you live in a society that passes on knowledge through oral tradition, you need to be a good narrator so that your messages are retained and transferred. And so clever people, we embed the names and deeds of our ancestors and of events and of different things that have happened throughout time into our landscape. And we know that all of the places around here are named after wonderful ancestors with deep culture and history behind them. So the importance of place names is something else that I promote because they share the narrative of this landscape. And quite often, if you're familiar with Te Reo Māori, they'll give you clues. Like sometimes I'm like, not very cryptic, our ancestors. So we've got places like Waituna. So, water where tuna is. We've got other places that will be described like Te Hāki Tukura, which is over in Queenstown, or Refuge Point. But Hāki Tukura is one of our wonderful ancestors who swam from the little beach area out to the point, and so we remember that. Here's me talking about it right now, like hundreds and hundreds of years later, but because we're able to continue that knowledge through cultural narrative. But one of the things that people forget about is that the sky is also a place where we put our stories. The sky is embedded with the names and deeds of our ancestors. And this is practice of people all throughout the world. And so I like to describe the sky as the pictures to our storybook. And when I look up there, I'm reminded once again of the cultural narratives of that knowledge that is there to be passed on. And in fact, when we get to talk about Matariki, you'll see how that can come about. I think I've covered everything on that. Okay, so now we're getting into the astronomy stuff. And once again, just declaring, I'm actually an arts student, so I didn't do sciences at school, but this is once again another good example of mātauraka Māori that I'm able to, through the broad cross-disciplinary nature of mātauraka Māori, I can articulate how the world works in a very fundamental and rudimental way, but it's still pretty accurate. I can determine what seasons we're in. Mind you, it's the south, it's just cold. That's the season. Jokes. Anyway, I digress. Tātai aroraki, astronomy, there are two kinds. Tātai aroraki is the observation and recording of the celestial activities, and tātai arawhetūraki is the interpretation of what's going on. So it's a bit like astronomy and astrology. However, with mātauraka Māori, really the two are complementary. So you're looking and observing, recording the data, and then what we're doing is going, how do we make that information? What are we seeing, and how is it relevant to us? And so I'm going to show you that in the next slide. But pretty much what we're doing is looking at the sky and then looking at the environment and going, when that star's up there, this plant's doing this. When that star's up there, this species is doing this. And so we anchor the two together. And in fact, we've got constellations like Tunanui, which is a big constellation that has 12 stars in it, and it rises up from November to June, and all of those stars represent a phase in the tuna cycle, or mahi associated with the tuna. So that's how we connect the two together. Okay, I'm also going to tell you about the maramataka, or the maramataka that I follow, which is a lunar stellar calendar system. So briefly, I know, is Te Anau time a real thing, or is it, right? Because I'm all about it. I'm like, time is ours, right? Okay, anyway. Currently, we're following a Gregorian calendar system, which is based on the sun. So it's a solar calendar. Traditional maramataka are based on moon time, but it's not just moon time. There's 4 facets of a maramataka. The other thing I want to say is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of maramataka, or lunar stellar calendar systems. And the reason for this is because they should be regionalised or localised, and you'll understand that more as I explain it. So the first aspect of a lunar stellar, so lunar, moon, stellar stars, is the sun. So the sun gives us seasonality. Well, we all know that when Earth is spinning and we're closest to the sun, we get more direct sunlight. So it's warmer, longer days, so on. When it's winter, we've spun round, the sun's on the other side, so we have less direct sunlight, it's not as warm. Easy. Māori articulate that totally different. So, and once again, this is an example of a cultural narrative. So we talk about seasonality through tamanui te reo, or the sun, and we say that he has a winter wife, which is Hini Takurua. She's the star Sirius, not in Canis Major. And then he also has a second wife, because this is atua, you know, we're not talking in the realms of people here. And her name is Hini Raumati, and she resides here in the warm earth soil. And so when the sun is with his winter wife, we have less daylight because he's away from us out at sea with his winter wife. And what actually happens, and this is one of the reasons why Matariki is so important, when the sun and Takurua, or the star Sirius, and Matariki all rise together on our eastern border, Matariki signals to the sun that it's time for him to return back to his summer wife. He's had enough time with his winter wife, he must go back to his other wife. And that's actually the winter solstice. And so from that point on, the sun will start to rise a little bit more south as we go. So we can articulate how seasonality works. We just have a fabulous story that goes with it, right? So that's the sun. The second part of the maramataka is the phase of the moon. So the phase of the moon pretty much is just the days of the month. Now, I've seen a lot of different maramataka. Some have 28 names for the phases of the moon. Some have 33. On average, most of them have about 30, and so then scientists say to me, there's only 29.5 phases of the moon. That's how long it takes for the moon to go round. And that's all good, because we're not trying to put squares into circles here, like they're two separate bodies of knowledge serving different purposes with some commonality. But what I say to people go, well, how can you have 33 if the moon's only got this many phases? What I say to them, have you looked at the moon? Have you spent some time with the moon? And what we know is that we also look at observations through a 24-hour time frame, right? But what can happen is, the moon might be up during the day and close in the west, and then as we spin round, the moon's over here towards the east, and the sunlight that's, wherever the big boy is going to depend on what the moon looks like, right? So you can have two different phases of the moon within a 24-hour time frame. We're not using 24-hour time frames when we're looking at the moon. And one of the things that I've noticed is that actually, because we're so far south, right, when I go up to the north, I'll be a little bit out with what moon phase that I think we're in, because actually, and even here in Te Anau is actually a really good example. You'll know you get all the sun, Isn't there a legend down south and you can read the paper at 11 p.m, in the height of summer? So those factors come into it, and that's what I was talking about. They should be regionalised and they should be localised. So depending on your GPS position will influence what you're seeing or not seeing. So the moon phases give us the days of the month. The third thing is the heliacal rising of stars. Now, that's just the pre-dawn rising of stars. And I follow a 13-star system. So there, and then people are, hang on, are there 13 months in the year? Sometimes there is. This year there is. So we know that we're always having to manipulate time. It's a scientific thing, it's called nudging. Always got to nudge time. The way that we recalibrate a Gregorian calendar system is with the leap year. So then we add the whole other day in. The way that the maramataka is recalibrated is that every third year we add an entire new month. And so we've just had Matariki in July. This year we'll have a 13-month system. And so the Matariki Public Holiday, it was in June this year, it'll be in July next year. So we're actually got our 13 months coming up. And I'm still new to the science and observation part of, my journey. But I am keeping an eye out that will there be a correlation with the 13-month and the big drought that we're expecting, not only through what we've seen through observations, but clear indications, right, from climate change. So watching this space. But that's the heliacal rising. So what we'll do is the star sets the month. So when we see a particular star on the horizon, we'll wait till we get to the right moon phase, and then that will set the month off. I follow a new moon to new moon cycle, but some people will do a full moon to full moon cycle. Once again, you've heard the saying, different strokes for different folks. I like to say different vibes for different tribes. So, it doesn't matter. Who am I to say how you should run your calendar system? And the other thing about the maramataka is the environmental indicators. And this is the bit that everybody leaves off any calendar system. I'm like, the world is the most, that's the oldest clock that we've got. Really, it's the sky, us spinning. But my point is that through maramataka, a lot of our stars, a lot of those ones that are rising, marking the month, are all about the activity that's happening here on Earth. And so I talked earlier about maramataka being regionalised or localised. If you live by the sea, then your maramataka is going to be synced in with the tides, because you're fishing. That's important, your waterways. If you're inland, your maramataka is probably going to be synced in with your birds. That's going to be your main source of protein, with your waterways, with your rivers and so on. So they should be localised. And what will happen is, when things are blooming, those are the indicators that actually we've got change happening and occurring. So that is the lunar stellar calendar system. Any questions? Awesome.
On that subject. So we say king tide or spring tide. Is there any advantage to the Māori?
Absolutely. So I've unpacked that a little bit, right? Because I needed to understand how does it work. Because I'm like, okay, what I know is that they'd figured it out, right? They knew how it worked. I wanted to know how it worked because nobody was telling me this is how it works, right? But, we know that, what is it? When the sun and the moon and the earth bulging, right? So we get bulges causing high tide, low tide, pulls the water out, pulls the water in. When you're fishing, species will come up when the tide's going out and so on and so forth. So they'd figured all that out. It's the same with our waterways. Fresh water runs to salt water, and there's that convergence there in the different activities. Once again, they'd all figured it out. I talked about our cultural narratives, the blueprints are there. So we just know things like full moon, don't go eeling, okay, cool. And then I'm like, I want to unpack that a bit. Why shouldn't we do that? And then that's when you can get into contemporary bodies of knowledge and unpack that a little bit more if you're like me and actually want to know all the whys. But that's an example. Any other questions or anything? Ka pai. Okay, so I also wanted to share how we apply this, and I've pretty much spoken to this predominantly. So we apply it through things like mahikakai, which you'll appreciate this if you work for DOC. It's like resource management, resource consent. This is the original, kind of health and safety of the environment stuff. But once again, this is linked to our whetū, to our celestial movements, to that maramataka. So when we're keeping environmental time, it's because kai is the purpose, that's our livelihood, so it's sunk into that. And there's various practitioners as well. So We forget about the weavers, we forget about the boat makers, the cartographers, all the people that are doing their bits and bobs, but they're all sunk in to a maramataka. And in fact, my research and also the research of some of the professors that teach me is that we didn't get to open a book that's, here's Māori astronomy, read this book. That's not how it goes down. It's like, here's a book about fishing that's got astronomical knowledge in it. Here's a book about gardening that's got astronomical knowledge in it. So that knowledge actually sits across the disciplines because it's connected to the environment and to our livelihood. And a lot of our oral kind of interviews is we're talking to people who go to the mud and bird islands, and they're prolific diary keepers, man, because it's all on this moon, I got this many birds, and mountain birds, they'll look out, right, I'm going to do this style of birding, or in this moon phase, I'm going to do that style of birding. They don't consider themselves to be, astronomers or to be dabbling in this type of magic, but they are. And it's the same with, fisher people and all the other people that are out there in the environment. They're using those natural things and applying that knowledge in a practical sense. Okay, so I thought that we'd cover some stuff about Matariki and Puaka since I didn't get to do it earlier. And so I wanted to just go over what is Puaka. So Puaka is the star Rigel in Orion, and that's a really terrible picture of Puaka, but the star at the top, I think most people know what the pot looks like, or tautoru. So Puaka is that star. And for many people in Ngāi Tahu, we acknowledge that star as being our star of the new year. And people will say, why? There's a couple of reasons. For me, I'm always saying, well, it's an important phase in the lunar stellar calendar system. And my observations have said it's an important phase because, one, it heralds the frost. So when Puaka is in a certain position in the sky, frosty boy is on his way. And when your livelihood relies on your crops and you need a good yield, you want to know when those frosts are coming. So that's the difference between a good yield or not. If you're out in the field, if you're up the river or inland doing your hunting and gathering, you need to get home before the big frost. So Puaka was would herald or signal that the frosts are on their way. The other big associations with Puaka I mentioned earlier, mutton birding. So when Puaka's in a certain position in the sky, our mutton birders go to the islands. When it moves around a little bit more, they come back. That's a really significant time. Our whānau coming back, it's the end of a season. So we put our Pākehā lens onto years, and we think of it in years. Think of it as seasons rather than that kind of Gregorian year.
So you're talking about when Puaka's rising in the morning or when it's setting in the evening?
So for the mutton birding, it's when it's setting, and then by the time it's rising, everybody's home again. Yeah, so everybody comes home before that rising again on the eastern border. Yep. And the other big thing that Puaka is associated with is our tuna migration. So once again, we have our tuna heke, or the migration. Once that work's all done, Puaka is resetting, rising again in the east. And so really it's the Puaka is the big star, that's the winter indicator, right? That's a seasonal shift. And the other thing that I actually think, these are two practical reasons. One is still that we're looking at astronomy with modern day lenses, and that people think if they can't pop outside their house and see a star, then that doesn't exist in this region or whatever. And so there are certain pockets within our tribal area that you cannot see these stars in the morning rising from the east unless you climb the hill or the mountain that's in your way, or pop round the side of it. And so not everyone would have done that. And so there would have been subject matter experts, the tohuka, or the wise astronomers that climbed the mountain and watched the observations, or go round out to the sea to watch the observations. And this is particularly true for our West Coast whānau, right? They're not going to be seeing that no matter how hard they try. They're going to have to get up the top of those mountains. So their cultural narratives and timekeeping will be set off something different, a little bit like puaka. And in fact, I have a lot of wise tribal members say to me, we don't celebrate Matariki, we can't see it here. And then I think, what have I been looking at for the last 15 years then? But I don't, right? Because everyone's got to go on the journey and not everyone's analysing things and trying to decode it, for example. Okay, so what is Matariki? Matariki is the star Alcyone in the star cluster M45 or Pleiades. It is also the name that's applied to the entire cluster, so a star in it, but also the entire cluster. Once again, really important phase in that maramataka or the lunar stellar calendar system. And the reason being is that Matariki alongside puaka, they're actually part of the same constellation in a broader spec. And that's a natural constellation that makes its way from the east to the west. It takes about 11 months of the year. So it's like a clock, right? So you can go, in the morning it's here in winter. In summer it's in the north in the night sky. In autumn it's starting to set in the western horizon. That never changes. So it's a natural timekeeping system. And in fact, Indigenous people and people all throughout the world plant and harvest according to the Pleiades for that nature. And there's been studies over in the Andes, for example, Andean potato farmers who plant by the Matariki cycle. And sometimes there was a study done a few years ago, and scientists went to find out more because some years they wouldn't even plant. So they were like, what is this? How do they know how, what is the connection with Pleiades or Matariki? And they talked to these people and they did some observations and different experiments. And what they found out is that the appearance of Matariki or the Pleiades, whether it's bright and pulsy or dim, for example, is related to the precipitation or the atmospheric conditions. And so, once again, millennia of observation, recording of all of this practice knows that when it looks like that, flood or rain is going to be here. So you're not going to plant because you don't want to lose your precious seeds. Or when it looks like that, it's going to be an amazing season. Let's plant more seeds. So they'd worked that out, and the same principle is applies here in the Pacific. So depending on its appearance will depend on whether you're going to have a good water season or, for example, a drought season, which was on the read this season. It also is, as I told you, that indicator for the winter solstice. So there's the connection there to let tamanui te rā to head back to Earth. So really, really important phase there. And then if I can link it back to some traditional knowledge again, I talked about the tuna migration and the TT migration. If we put that in the context of traditional times, there would have been casualties during those times. So if anyone knows what going to the Mutton Islands like now, you pop on a chopper and it's still pretty hard to get off there, and boats and all the rest of it. Picture doing that on like old school waka, like that's quite treacherous work. Not only that, if you're making your way down from Christchurch to the Mutton Islands, that in itself is a big journey. And depending on where you're going, you're crossing over big rivers, and she's a bit of a high-end risky job. But also the same with all our people that are in the rivers, in the lakes, and so on and so forth. So in any community, you're going to have some casualties. There is also going to be loss at the home front, you know, just natural things that are a part of life. So when our people go out and they come back together, as I said, they come back at the end of the season. And what we naturally do is share information and grieve and acknowledge all of those people that we'd lost. So remembrance and reflection is a huge element of that Matariki practice, and I think it stems from those traditional concepts. The other thing, if we think about a maramataka in Matariki, another one of its practices is that reflection and remembrance, in that it gives us an opportunity to process grief. So once again, these are blueprints on how we can live our life, you know, in a way that people have figured out this might be a good way to do that. And sharing grief and reflecting is also good when you've got your posse around you, right? So you've got all the whānau together. So I think that it's a really good practice. The other thing that's just happened is people have just done the biggest reconnaissance mission and done a cultural stock take on how the environment's going. So everyone's come back in to the pa or to the village from being out in the field. And so they're able to report, this river's looking really good, the kanakana are going to be on this season, or there's heaps of raupo down in this area, perhaps we want to go and target that area to make our waka this year, and so on and so forth. Or the birds in this area were pretty low, you know, it doesn't look like it's been a good hatching season, so we might not go to that particular forest. So everyone comes in and we share some intel. And what that does is it helps us to prep and plan for the next season. So once again, those are part of the principles and practices that surround Matariki in a traditional context. In a modern day context, we can still do those things, right? We can still get together, and we should, and talk about our family and reflect and remember those that aren't with us anymore and celebrate the new ones that are with us. And also, you know, take stock. How is everyone going? You know, how's our well-being factor? All of that type of thing. And I think those are things that in a modern day society, we don't prioritise them as much as we could. And so this is some of the value that I think people can take out of that Matariki Public Holiday, because that's the one thing that's given us is time. It's given us time and space to be able to reconnect with each other, but also to reconnect with the environment. And for me, that's the big well-being factor. So yeah, look at me waving the Matariki flag. This is a picture of Matariki from like a Māori perspective. So there's 9 stars in the cluster. Now, for quite some time, Matariki was promoted as having 7 stars. And there are 2 schools of thought for that. One is that there are other cultural narratives that talk about Pleiades and, you know, the 7 sisters, and in Japan they have Subaru, and, you know, as I said, Pleiades, this is a famous star cluster, man. So there's been a bit of merger of cultural narratives. So that's, you know, that's one of the factors. Another line of thought is that the 2 stars that were left out of the cluster were kind of the important stars. And as I'll show you, I'll talk to the stars now and you'll be able to see that. So we've got over there Aoraki and Anuku. So those are our 2 stars associated with pretty much gardening. So things that are grown in the ground, things that grow in Papatuanuku, and things that grow above the ground or close to Raki. So that's like our birds, Central Otago apricots, or some cherries, things like that. But what there is these balance there, earth-sky balance. We have Matariki in the middle. Matariki is associated with health and well-being. And in fact, the father of this cluster is Reo, which is another big player in the sky, which is the star Antares. And we might get to see him tonight if we go out. And then we've got Ururaki, which is the star associated with the wind. Waipunaraki, the star associated with rains. We have Waiti and Waita, so fresh water, salt water, female, male balance, and it's always going to look this way. If you've got salt water running to fresh water, we're in big trouble. And then we've got the oldest star of the cluster, which is Pohutukawa, and the youngest star, which is Hiwa Itiraki. So Pohutukawa is the star that we associate with our loved ones who have passed, and Hiwa is about prosperity, our wishes and our aspirations. Once again, kind of like life, death, balance. So the cluster in general has that balance as well. And so we, the Star Wars fans get this. I'm like the Death Star, right? Once again, part of that remembrance thing. And so one of the stories goes is that when we lose our loved ones, they go up into the skies on this waka called Te Aoraki, which has Matariki at the front of it. And we send our loved ones to Pohutukawa so that she can look after them. And I like to sell this constellation as just think of like a big, massive cruise liner with all of the awesome people who have passed away, and they're just having a great time with all the atua, all of the stars, all of their loved ones that had passed before them and so on. So they're in this big cruise liner going across the sky, and then it starts to set in the west around May, June-ish, because once again we're talking Gregorian time with a lunar stellar calendar system. So once the waka sets, what our cultural narrative tells us is that A, we're in freedom time. So that is a time that is like no restrictions, which also, if you think about the practicality, we've talked about seasonality. It's a time of the season where everything's doing its thing. So we get to, put the feet up for a little bit. That's also the time where we probably make babies and things like that. So it's all kind of scheduled in, linked around food. So literally, we have stars that we associate that indicate this is the time where you should be having your babies. And through a traditional lens, that's because when your baby's born, there's going to be heaps of kai, right? And you're not going to be out in the field travelling and so on and so forth, because we also know that that's not a very advantageous way to live your life, as, 9 months pregnant, trying to climb over the Alps. I've got my baby now. So that stuff didn't happen, right? So we were able to sync it in with all the natural timekeeping. I'm starting to digress. Anyway, right. So the waka sets. And so our narrative tells us that during that time, our loved ones go to Hininui Te Pō, or to the goddess of death. And they have 4 weeks going through a process of being in the underworld and being prepared to be stars. So we also think that once we die and we've had our big trip on the cruise liner, and depending on when you die, right, you might have a long trip. If you died 1 week, if it's up, you've got the VIP suite. But if you die 1 week before it sets, you're still on there. So, that the cycle doesn't change. You don't get to go, okay, my ticket's for 12 months regardless. So you go on there, you go down, you get prepared, and then when that heliacal rising occurs, that is when we release our dead. So we get another opportunity. Once again, I think these are blueprints for some really good processing of grief. So we get to go out, we get to release them, the season closes, we take a stock take, we take a read, and then we look to the prospect of a new season, new aspirations, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the other things that I like to add when I share that narrative is that constellation also has in the very spot where we say that our loved ones are where they hang out or reside, is a star nursery. So what that means is that millions of new stars are made in that very constellation. So I think that's pretty awesome as well. And if you break it down a few, because once again I'm quite pragmatic, I'm like, our whakapapa, so I talked about whakapapa or genealogy at the beginning. It starts here at the singularity. Science tells us that each and every one of us has star dust or star particle in our DNA. And in fact, every living thing on the earth has star DNA. So our narratives tell us this. Our DNA also tells us this. So our narrative concludes with, we come from there and we go back to there as well. So that's Matariki. We're nearly at the end of my slide. So I did want to, I think I've talked to most of these things. What can Matariki look like for you? And I think that as a community, you're well on track. So it's about that remembrance. It's also about sharing and feasting and discussion and environmental awareness. So I've talked about all of these in a traditional kind of setting, saying we've come in, we talk about the state of the whenua. We've also just done all of the fishing, all of the birding, so our pantries are full, so we feast and acknowledge that hard work. We also have wānaka or discussion. That's about what are we going to do next. We're getting prepared. But in a contemporary setting, we can still do all of these things. And I certainly encourage people to share kai with each other. Nothing like a good potluck, especially during winter, right? Who doesn't need some winter relief and a bit of a reset? It's good to have a catch up, how things are going. I'm like, I get to have 2 New Year's resolutions, you know, reset again. That one didn't quite pay off. And, you know, for me, when we had our first gathering for the Matariki Advisory Group up in Wellington, I was talking with my colleagues and I'm like, they didn't even realise this is about the environment. They don't realise this is about light pollution. This is about fireworks. But that's all right. We'll just slowly bring people in and then go, ta-da! And I think that it's getting there. And we're certainly trying to promote this. And, you know, with the way of the world at the moment, it's really nice to just have some things that remind us and give us a mechanism to be able to have that time and maybe think about those things. So these are some things that you might want to think about. How do you connect with each other and how do you connect with the environment? And if you're setting some goals, because everyone loves a good New Year goal set and send some wishes away, make that about you. But if you think about, I've just shared a big presentation about how important whakapapa is and how we're connected to the environment and so on and so forth. So if you think about yourself, but also think about others and think about the environment, because I would like to think that lots of people see themselves in those spaces. That's not just a Māori concept, that might be just a humanity concept, but I'm also a bit of a, you know, got the old optimism on at a high level, so just throwing that out there, whatever seeds will seed. And my last slide, so wrapping it all into kind of matariki and what can you do and what is this mātauraka stuff. For me, I think, hopefully I've given you some insights, that this is a way that we can contribute to improving our practices through an Indigenous lens. And in fact, last night I was at a symposium and I was talking to someone who lives in Lake Harbour and she's got the only carbon neutral farm or something like this, and wonderful, we're having really good chats. And then I said, well, given that New Zealand was pretty much the last place in the world to be discovered and, you know, to start building up a society, is that we still have that indigeneity as a nation, really, that, you know, that connection, the landscape, it hasn't got hundreds of years of industrial revolutionary things built up in it. And so I feel that we're in a really good space as a nation to have solutions for these issues that we're facing. So she was like, never thought of that. Tell others. You know, and it's a lens that considers traditional and contemporary knowledge. And once again, I think these are just principles that all of us can appreciate and connect with. And, you know, it's always health and wealth and, you know, where are those priorities? And I think that probably need to get that balance adjusted a little bit more. And we've got to remember it's evolving. You know, we want to build this knowledge because if we think of whakapapa and that genealogy, my sole mission, and this is hand on heart actually my life's mission, is just to make the world a better place for my children. And I would hope that they would want to make the world a better place for their children. And once again, I think these are values that we can all connect on. And so it's like, what are you doing to ensure that you are leaving a legacy for your children, for your grandchildren, that you can actually be proud of? And we've got the power, right? We've got social attitude, and we have the influence with consuming. Just putting the power back in our hands, you know. Don't be dismissive of how, as a community, as a society, we can influence how we consume things in the world. So it's all about supply and demand. If you say, actually, not going to do that, you know, 10 years ago, who would have thought that we're all going to have 50,000 paper countdown bags stuffed in our boot, and then the other, you know, 40 bags that are in the basement because every time you go in a different vehicle, you've got to buy a new set. But we're doing it right. We're doing that, and we're thinking about all these innovative ways that we can actually still have our cake and eat it too. And that's really what we should be focusing on, and be excited about that. And that's one of the beautiful things about Aotearoa, is that we're onto it, man. You know, they shot over jets with Hamilton jets and, you know, splitting atoms and climbing big mountains. We're out there doing it. So we've definitely got the power. And if anything, connecting through that indigeneity around, you know, connection to each other, but also thinking of each other in a bit of an extension to that. So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been my hot mess of many topics, thrown in, trying to give you as much as I can to hopefully, you know, give you something that you can think about and that you might have connected to. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.